What's going on, everyone? Welcome to a new episode of Talk of the Town. This is a podcast where we talk about all things media, creators, business, and more. My name is Tristin. I'm the host of the podcast. If this is your first time listening to the podcast, thank you for tuning in. And if you're returning from previous episodes, thank you so much for listening to new episodes. Today, we got a really special guest on the podcast, someone who I've had great conversations with in the past, and lucky to have them. Henry, introduce yourself.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here as well. Essentially, my background in the creator economy is I started off as a creator. So I hosted a podcast kind of like this, all about gaming. And after doing that for about 4 years, opened a ton of doors for me. I worked in influencer marketing for about 2 years at an agency, working with a lot of the big brands. Then I kind of decided, hold up, I got into this industry to help creators, and now I'm negotiating against them. So I then kind of transitioned into more of an entrepreneurial path of building tools for creators, building companies for creators. And that's probably what we're going to talk about more so today.
Absolutely. So, starting from the rip, how did you get into content? Was there like a particular creator that you like first dived into, or was it just something like natural?
Yeah. So ever since I was a kid, I watched a lot of YouTube. That was kind of my main platform. Never got super into Instagram or TikTok or Twitter. YouTube has kind of always been my home of consuming content. But when it came to actually producing content myself, that was all about a single video game called Apex Legends. So I started a podcast called The Third Party. And to be honest, the story there was I didn't listen to podcasts at the time, and I did not think that a podcast about a visual video game would get any notoriety. Thankfully, I was wrong, but that's kind of how I got into it. Was I really liked this one game? I felt like I should do something productive because I was already talking with my roommate about the game every day. So we started a podcast.
Absolutely. I guess, what are some of the earliest like lessons you learned from doing that podcast? Like things that you tried to do differently than other creators in that particular, genre of content?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, what we saw with the existing podcast within our niche was they were inconsistent. They weren't incredibly professional with how they outlined their run of show. And so we felt like we could bring in a lot of kind of just effort and consistency into the niche. And that was really successful for us. So, a lot of the early lessons were have a regular recording schedule so we can be consistent with our uploads, and then kind of have a detailed show doc for what we were going to talk about. And the reason for that was we positioned ourselves as a news podcast and more of an educational podcast. So, how can people improve in the game? How can they learn new things based off of the current changes? Because it was a live service game, so much was happening on a weekly basis. So, there's plenty of content to structure around.
What would you say some of the highlights, like the moments that you're proud of with that podcast are?
Yeah, I think one of the coolest things that we ever did was when we added video to our kind of content stack was we produced a limited run of full-size movie posters based off characters in the game with our names on them, and then we gave those away to our patrons. So that was a pretty sweet merch thing that we were able to do, and worked with a designer that was in the space. That's currently hanging on my wall in the hallway. So that's something I look at every day, and I'm pretty happy we did that.
So, are you still doing the podcast, or what does it look like today?
I retired from that podcast about a year ago. But yeah, we did about 300 episodes. So I feel like we talked about Apex enough.
Yeah, Apex is always a game that I have wanted to play. I tried to play it, and the unfortunate thing is, I found out that during the Christmas holiday last year, somebody in another continent hacked my EA account and got it banned.
Oh,
So I'm no longer allowed to play any EA games online for like probably eternity because um, that EA account was tied directly to my Xbox account. So, that was a fun thing to learn one day. I had bought like Game Pass to play Madden and tried to get online, and they're like, your account's banned. I'm like, what did I do? I'm like, I very rarely ever play EA games. So,
That's heartbreaking.
if anyone from EA is listening to this podcast, please help me. But moving from there, like did some really interesting things, like you mentioned in the influencer space. You worked for AFK. Kind of talk about what AFK is for those that don't know, and then what your role was.
Yeah, so essentially, my professional entry into the creator economy was at AFK Creators. It's now called AFK Digital, the kind of department that I worked in. And that was essentially influencer marketing services, where I was an account manager. So I worked directly with brands in order to manage their influencer marketing campaigns. Most of what we did was based around YouTube and Twitch, but over the years that expanded into Instagram, Twitter, TikTok. And then one of my achievements in that role was to really introduce them to podcast influence marketing. And so we were able to add that as a capability. But that was essentially my experience.
What were some of the brands that you got to work with during your time? And are there any brands that you would have wanted to work with for influencers that you didn't get to cross off the bucket list?
Yeah, a good question. So a few of my key accounts at AFK were Manscaped, NordVPN, and then we did some big campaigns with Amazon Games. And so being able to work with large budgets that were doing pretty sophisticated campaigns was a pretty incredible opportunity as a recent college graduate with very little experience. So I learned a ton very quickly. Some of the brands that I really like that I hope to work with in the future. Um, Man, I really love Elgato and their products. I think we could do a lot of great stuff with them.
Yeah.
Hexclad is also maybe a bit of a nerdy one, but it's a cooking wear brand that's endorsed by Gordon Ramsay. I love their products, and they're now just starting to get into podcasts. So hope to work with them someday soon.
See, for me, I'm very much of like, I sort of tailored my influencer like partnerships for myself around brands that I tried first and then fell in love with.
Yeah.
So like, Elgato, like never worked with them, but like my microphone is Elgato. For many years I had the HD60. Like it's actually funny. Up until last year, I think I had the original HD60 for like 7 years.
Wow.
Yeah, since like it's 7 or 8 years, and until it like bricked itself, but it was already getting to that point where it was like doing it. Um, but the funny thing is, like, for me as someone who became also like an investor in startups, I found it's like a non-traditional way of being able to do influencer marketing is like, hey, putting up capital and then being like, I'm just going to promote you because I want this company to succeed now.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So I think like that's a great way of doing things. Um, you know, between doing the podcast and AFK, like, were there any lessons that you learned doing the podcast that like helped you at AFK?
I think being a creator that was then working full time in influencer marketing taught me a lot about how creators think and how they approach brand deals, which was absolutely valuable. It also allowed me to relate to them when I spoke with managers or directly to those influencers. And so I think that it was kind of perfect in a lot of ways.
You know, you touched on being able to relate to creators, and I think that's something that really a lot of people don't understand. Like, us as creators, we're human beings first before the digital personas.
Yeah.
We have thoughts, emotions. I always like to compare creators to like Shaquille O'Neal when he was building his business career, like everyone thought like, oh, okay, Shaq, like we'll talk to your agent first versus like you. It's like,
Mm.
he got to the point where he's like, no, you're gonna talk to me. Um, but like, what do you think like the creator mindset that you picked up on and like the way of doing things was
Yeah.
from your time working at AFK?
Yeah. So a lot of my lessons as a creator myself and my experience at an influence marketing agency played into why I went out to build Creator OS. And even from that experience, which we can go deeper into, one of my big takeaways was most creators are closer to a lifestyle entrepreneur than a small media company owner. And what I mean by that is the motivations and incentives are entirely different when someone's operating a lifestyle business. A lot of the things that really encourage creators and what they strive for are creative freedom, a lack of management, balance in their life between work and life. And so that really informed a lot of my perspective on how we build tools for creators, how we do brand deals with creators, how people should work with creators, if it's a company or even a manager, and that they might not be as motivated by money as you are as a business person. So that was kind of a huge understanding for me that definitely has informed everything that I do in my career moving forward.
There's two really interesting things that you said there that I wanted to touch and have expanded. The first is that creators seem to be wanting like less management, more decision making. Do you think that, sort of like with this trend that we've seen of TikTokers and in influencers elsewhere who are sort of building their own management teams around them, or like a lot of the times now with TikTok, you won't see as many creators who have influencer agencies or talent management agencies in their emails. It's
Yeah.
their personal email. Do you think that that's sort of a cause and effect of what the influencer space has been like? And
Yeah.
then additionally, I think the other thing that you really like highlighted is that creators are sort of this like less entrepreneurial and more like focused on building like a personal brand around them and then letting that business opportunity be an extension of who they are.
Yeah, I think those are some really good points, let alone questions. I think that that last thing you said, we see so evidently in a term switch from influencers to content creators. They're not necessarily priding themselves on influencing an audience, but more so focused on the content they create and that personal brand around them. So I think that's spot on. In terms of like less creators seeking management, I kind of have two perspectives on it. One is creators traditionally don't want to deal with contracts and invoicing and negotiation. That stuff is not fun. I don't particularly enjoy doing it. It's definitely a means to the end. So if they can bring somebody onto their team to deal with that so they can focus more on the content or just relaxing, it's a pretty easy decision. The other part of it is talent managers, I think for most creators that are kind of small to medium size, which is the vast majority of the market, managers are just something that they feel like they have to do. And they're willing to give up 20% of their brand deals to do it, but only to get more deals. And so I feel that now that the industry is maturing, more and more brands are expanding into influencer marketing, budgets are going up, brands are directly reaching out to creators. The need for a manager to go out and find those opportunities has gone down. And so the trend that you've kind of picked up on, that less new creators that are coming into content creation as a career path feel the need for a manager because brands are coming to them directly. They don't have that need to give away 20% to a manager anymore. So I think that's my perspective on a few of those trends. I have a lot of talent manager friends. I don't necessarily think they're obsolete, but I think for those small to medium, they're definitely slower to reach out and want to get a manager because the pressure isn't there.
Absolutely. So moving from there, Creator OS, kind of talk about what that project was. Like, what problem were you trying to solve with that, and like, what are some of the, I guess, like lessons you learned and the mistakes that you made from that?
Oh man, hopefully we have enough time to go into it. Uh, it was a great opportunity for learning. So, Creator OS was something that I sought out to build last year near the beginning. And the vision was to build a platform for creators to have both their content analytics and their revenue streams all in one place. And what that would look like would be able to have a YouTube video and assign that all the pieces of revenue associated with it, from merch sales to ad revenue to specific brand deals to maybe even subscriptions or membership services, so that you could look at a creator business like a traditional business, really bringing in easy to use accounting tools directly into planning your content across multiple platforms. The first lesson I learned was that is a very ambitious tool. So it was a lot
Yeah.
more complicated than I initially thought. My mind was kind of set in, oh, this is a simple CRM for creators. It can't be that difficult.
Yes, I can.
Way more difficult than I thought. So that was lesson number one. Lesson number two, I would say, is I set out to build a tool for professional creators. And the reality is that is a much smaller market than I think most people realize. Um, Creator OS was a B2B SaaS tool for creators that were on multiple platforms and had multiple revenue streams, people that actually needed a tool to organize their business and then could afford to invest in that. I was really set on the creators being that end customer because I wanted their needs to incentivize the company and its development. Um, I think moving forward, I want to build something that more creators can use. And so that affects how we're going to monetize, who we're going to build for, how sophisticated those tools need to be. And so that was a big lesson, but it was also bigger than that because if you were my target creator, you probably already had somebody that was managing your accounting, your analytics, your content as a channel manager. So there wasn't really a need for Creator OS as I had envisioned it, um, as much as I thought.
Yeah, one thing that I also wonder is like with a lot of these link and bio platforms like Beacons or Pillar or
Mhm.
some of the other more advanced ones out there that have popped up in recent years, a lot of them have also started to put in a lot of these features of like invoicing and memberships and courses and being able to like deal with brands like directly.
Yeah.
Do you think that sort of disrupted the momentum that you guys possibly had?
I don't necessarily believe it disrupted, but I think they're doing a lot of things right. Um, Creator OS didn't really intend on doing those, but what companies like Stan are achieving, where they have a monthly fee for
Yeah.
essentially a Shopify for creators, where it's a link in bio tool that also allows you to sell e commerce memberships, just like you mentioned. They're having incredible success. Millions and millions of dollars in annual reoccurring revenue at this point, tens of thousands of creator users. Um, that sort of model is perfect. Creator OS didn't intend on making creators money. It just intended to organize their business, which, looking back, not a very compelling value proposition. So that's another lesson as a takeaway.
And then lastly on that before we transition to other things, do you think there's a point in time where you might want to revisit and revive Creator OS?
Yeah. I mean, as someone who went to business school and studied operations, I love the idea of an operating system for creators. And really, what I'm working on now maybe will become Creator OS in the future. So the answer is definitely yes, that right now it's on the back burner, but there's a lot of steps we need to do in order to realize that initial vision.
Absolutely. So this is the point in time in the podcast where I like to throw sort of a wrench into things and let you take over as a host, ask questions or bring up topics that you want to talk about. So Henry, the floor is yours.
Okay, sweet. So, one of the things that I'm working on right now is a more specific venture for creators called RepBot. And the idea is to provide an AI agent for small to medium creators to help them negotiate better brand deals.
Sure.
This is kind of my way of scoping down to solve one specific problem for a more broad set of creators. Um, so what do you think about that? Do you think there's a need for a product like that? And maybe I can pick your brain a little bit.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think like I've always said that the more creator like focused startups out there that can fix or sort of um change the way that business is being done is always like important. And whether or not like it works initially or not, I think is something that I'm still not even qualified to answer. Like 12 years into being a creator and running creator startups as well is like something I've found that like it takes time and patience. And I think there's always that weird thing of like building a startup takes patience, and then like getting like investors and venture is like very much the opposite of like you must grow at all costs and like scale rapidly, and it leads to a lot of problems. But I think solving a problem for like as many creators as possible at a broad like audience range is always the best way to go about it. So I think like you've hit the nail right there in terms of like market fit.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited to hear that. I like that you said that like growing at all cost, and when you talk about venture backable startups and the creator economy, it's kind of difficult. With
Yeah,
Creator OS, I kind of had a dream of doing that and raising $1 million and trying to take on this huge market. With RepBot, I'm trying to move slowly. I'm trying to really build a community around this product where it's simple. We're trying to solve one problem, and if it works, we'll scale from there. I'm pretty hesitant to bring on any sort of investment at this point because I want to make sure this thing works.
yeah.
I don't want there to be outside pressure to scale something when I'm not even exactly sure what this market looks like.
I think that's the other thing too about founders is like we can always be like, this is a great idea, but in actuality, it's like it's not just what we think. It's like what does the market think?
Yeah.
It's like you can have like really great startups that, like, and I've seen a lot of great startups over time, and then there's like always where it's like for whatever reason people become disassociated to it, and it's like, well, great concept but terrible in actual like practical or practice.
Yeah, I mean, the execution is everything, and it's something that I worry about a lot, even with RepBot, is that I feel in the creator economy, the standards are really high. You have to come to the market with a fairly polished product that really works. And something that I've been working on for now the last year or two is how do you build a tool for a creator when a creator is such a broad term? Are you talking about streamers? Are you talking about YouTubers, TikTok, LinkedIn writers, bloggers?
Yeah,
Being a creator is a broad term. And so when you're building a tool for them or providing a service, defining that, but also not making it too niche where you don't have a business. That's something that I find to be very difficult.
absolutely. Any creator focus questions or topics that you want to talk about as well?
Something that I've been thinking about recently that I'm curious to get your perspective because you've been around the industry for a long time
Yeah.
is Do you think money corrupts content creation? A lot of people think about big name creators, even Mr. Beast, as a negative outcome that, oh, as soon as people could make money creating content, things got worse. Do you agree with that? Or what's your thought on money in the creator economy?
You know, this is funny because when I started making content 12 years ago, as a teenager in the gaming space, I was solely focused on like the milestones that like everyone wants to achieve. Like, okay, like for me, I was like within like 2 or 3 years, I want to have like 50,000 subscribers and be able to like make this like a full time job. And like, you know, I think if I could go back in time, um, I probably would backhand 12-year-old me and be like, don't do that. Just
Okay.
focus on like making great content.
Hmm.
Um, which like I was always focused on doing that. But like, hey, like don't necessarily focus as much on monetization and like getting partnered with like a big network or something like that. I think more of it is fame corrupting creators and
Ah,
money plays a part in that. I like we're seeing this right now with like a lot of creators sort of in this like bro culture where like the Jack Dohertys of the world or like other creators are doing these like childish antics, constantly, trying to provoke like angry reactions out of people,
mm,
really be like disruptive. Sort of like how Logan Paul was back in the mid 2010s, although be it like compared to back then, like I think most people have like their wits about them of like right and wrong of like, hey, maybe we don't go to like the forest in Japan and like film, I won't say exactly what it was,
yeah.
but like I don't see that ever happening. Or like if it does happen, it won't be like as impactful in the rest of the creator space. But I think like what's happened is you see a lot of these creators, not just in the gaming space, but also in like the culture space or like other like areas that really let like fame go to their head or like fame becomes like the thing around them, and then like after that money gets involved and it's very much of like a nightmare to get out of. Like this is something that's happening right now in like the finance YouTube space where it's like finance YouTubers are always promoting like um finance startups out there,
Yeah.
whether it's like Yada or FTX, but then it's like
Crypto.
yeah, well it's not
Yeah.
just that, but like when like the FTX thing happened, there were a lot of creators who were like, well, I just did a brand deal. Like, I shouldn't be held liable for this. And it's like, yes, you should be, because your like fame and influence could have caused people to lose money. The same thing with like, I think um, there's been like over time where creators have launched startup projects of their own. Like Pokimane came out last year with like a cookie snack brand or something, I think it was, and people like realized that like that was just like a white label thing that then like she created her own brand around and then sold it at like a higher premium price, and like people were like no, like like you're detached from who your audience is. um and so I think it's more about like the fame corrupting people.
Yeah.
um and I think people like Mr. Beast have done a really good job of like not letting that happen. Like I think Jimmy has always surrounded himself with good people. But I think it also just has to do with like probably his upbringing as a person. It's like he's someone who came from making videos in a bedroom playing Call of Duty to being able to do some of the most amazing things that he's doing right now. Whereas like, to sort of give like a different like spectrum, let's take like Olivia Jade, the daughter of Lori Loughlin. when that whole college admissions thing happened, it's like, she lost a beauty line with Sephora. She lost practically her entire audience flipped on her. Fame was like what built her and like her family. Um, and like at the end of the day, it like destroyed them. So
Yeah. That's a That's a really true and honest perspective. I like that a lot, that it's more so the fame than the money, because my perspective is money is a great thing. It's a tool,
yeah,
without
it's
people being able to
money
make
is a
money.
tool to make you happy, but like you get to a point where it's the same thing with like fame, where it's like, okay, I'm famous, but like I want to be more famous. Whereas like with
Mm,
money, it's like money can be used in good and bad ways, not just like as a creator, but also like as a person in general. Um, and I think again, it just comes down to like who you are, like how you were raised, like how you were taught to either carry yourself or like how to be financially smart.
yeah. I think that makes a ton of sense. I think that a lot of what we're seeing in the creator economy is also because there's a high level of scrutiny. You talk about a couple examples of
Yeah,
a creator's audience turning on them, or not liking one of the businesses they're doing, or not liking one of the brand deals they're doing.
yeah,
We're living in a pretty unique point in history where creators are seen as businesses, which are pretty powerful media platforms where the audience can now hold the owner to account. You don't
yeah.
really see that with any other type of media, whether it's a sports team or a TV network or a channel. So it's kind of an intense time because creators really have a high bar of accountability to their audience, and that's definitely a good thing.
Yeah.
But it's hard when you're a creator and you just want to pay the bills, and a brand comes knocking. It's FTX. It doesn't seem too bad, and then there's a scandal, and you're left feeling a lot of the heat.
Well, I mean,
It's hard.
and that's a really good like. And sorry for cutting you off there. There was a situation that happened like a couple months ago with a creator. I forget her name, but she went to the Met Gala and
Yes.
like she filmed a TikTok while she was there, and like everyone like let her have it online. And then like afterwards, she like did sort of like in between like an apology and a defense of being like, yes, I went to this, but like, I'm just like all of you. And then it's, like people finding out like, no, she's paying $17,000 a month for rent in New York. Like nobody's doing that,
Yeah.
or like the vast majority of people don't have 17 grand to spend on rent, for like a single month. And so then like, again, there's always just like this disconnect. And like, I feel like because of like the culture of Instagram and TikTok and YouTubers that are getting criticized, like I think it is a net positive for people's personalities as well.
Yeah. And I think that's a really good takeaway to have, is that there's always lessons to be learned, and people are always improving. A lot of times, I like to come back to the point of, hey, a lot of these negative things that we might see in the news, they're outliers. The creator economy is built up of so many small and large communities of people that make people's lives a lot better. That's a huge reason why I got into creating content. That's why I enjoy working in this industry so much. And so I see these outliers, and I think there's great lessons to learn. But I also see that's not the whole industry. And these big creators that maybe they've made a couple mistakes, maybe they let the fame get to them, like you said, but at the same time, they're making really great content that the masses are
Yeah,
enjoying. Let's kind of assess them based off of their skill. We don't have to put everybody's life under a magnifying glass. And I think as time goes on, we'll get a lot better about that as a society, of allowing people to be authentic people that make mistakes, and we don't have to end their career or hate them online because of their mistakes.
Now, one thing that I wanted to ask, and this is more of a personal question, is both from being a creator and both from being on the influencer like account manager side of things. Do a lot of the have you taken a lot of the things that you've seen happen in the industry where like fame gets to people's heads, or a lot of the sort of like mental burnout and challenges that people go through? Like I think especially coming out of the pandemic, I see like a lot more creators who are dealing with like social anxiety or deeper like issues. Have you ever had any of those happen to you, and to the willing you're open to talking about, like how have you tried to navigate those while staying positive?
Yeah. So I can only speak to my experience. And to be honest, as a creator myself, I didn't experience a lot of, burnout or mental health related issues. A lot of the reason I think that was I had a very limited schedule. I only recorded my podcast once a week. We ended up streaming once a week as well. And so I had a lot of time outside, away from content creation to give me a little bit more room to live and not always be sucked in to social media. But I can say that as a influencer marketer, I work with brands and creators, and it's my job on a day-to-day basis to educate and explain to brands that influencers or creators are people. And it happens very regularly that a creator has to back out of a deal, or they're no longer interested in a sponsorship because they need to take a break, or something happened in their personal life where they need to go on vacation or they get sick. Creators are people. And so it's not like other forms of advertising. So I can tell you that on a weekly basis, I'm having personal conversations with creators about their lives and how that impacts whatever sponsorship or marketing campaign I'm working on.
Absolutely. So moving from there, back into sort of your background, you launched Creator Consult and as well as Soundwave. Talk about each one of those businesses, and why you think like that was a natural progression for you coming out of both AFK and the podcast.
Yeah, so Creator Consult was kind of my first step into trying to help more creators directly, and that quickly evolved into Creator OS. And so I still operate Creator Consult. However, it's not the majority of my day to day work. I realized pretty early on that if I want to help creators, one on one was really difficult because I had to charge a lot of money to be a consultant who didn't operate as a talent manager, but just had to charge based off of, hey, I can help you start a Patreon. I can help you hire a production team. That's a very premium service that isn't very accessible. So I quickly realized that building software that could be more accessible was my way forward. But speaking to Soundwave, that was kind of after I decided to put Creator OS on pause. Let's take it back to my roots of being a podcaster myself and having experience in influencer marketing. So, Soundwave is essentially my current day job where I work with brands to introduce them into podcast marketing and specifically influencer marketing within that channel. And I got into that because after spending almost a year trying to build a startup, I still wanted to be an entrepreneur, but I needed a business model that had more cash flow potential. I needed to pay the bills because I'm just a regular guy. So having a model like an agency where if we're working, we're invoicing was a lot more attractive to me than something like Creator OS, where it could take years of development and investing money and resources before we ever make a dime. So that was kind of catching everybody up to speed on where my career is at now.
One thing that I think is interesting is the rise of like podcast marketing, podcast networks, and
Mhm.
also just seeing like independent media brands kind of come out of doing like podcasts or like newsletters, like Morning Brew, started as a newsletter, became a media company.
Yeah.
Our Future, practically the same thing. Um, how do you think that like way of doing business has influenced you? And then also like what sets you guys different from like other podcast groups out there?
Yeah. So it's definitely impacted what I'm currently doing and why I'm doing it extremely. So the first thing I can say about the podcast industry is it's very different from YouTube. If you've been in the industry for a while, the current podcast ecosystem is dominated by networks, which function very similar to MCNs back in the early days of YouTube, where in order for advertisers to come in, they would very much like to bundle together channels or podcasts in order to sell advertising across multiple rather than just one to one. YouTube and TikTok and Twitch have kind of outgrown that to now have individual managers representing individual creators, not necessarily selling ad campaigns across multiple, but more one off deals. And that's probably because they grew independently and we wanted more specific targeting for those advertisers. Podcasts, a little bit behind. And so we have networks, and I was a part of multiple networks as a podcast host. And in some ways, I loved it because I didn't have to do a whole lot of work. The network would sell ads for me. They would record those ads and then they would automatically place those ads in front of my episode or in the middle of my episode, wherever I told them to have an ad break. And then I got a check. So it was pretty great. But there's also a downside of that, and it's that they take a pretty hefty fee. And so it's pretty standard within podcasting for a network to charge 30 to 50% of whatever revenue they're charging to the brands or making as a network. Um, right now, you do not see a lot of talent agencies that represent podcasts exclusively. And I see that as a big opportunity. So, Soundwave is currently talent agnostic, meaning we don't represent any exclusive podcasts. We more so want to work with brands so we can introduce them to the space. And then once we establish ourselves over the next few years, the hope is that with the relationships that we've then cultivated, both with brands and creators, we have a lot of trust built up so that we could represent podcasts exclusively to help them scale out their memberships, their content, businesses around them. And so that's kind of the vision with Soundwave and how I view the podcast industry.
Two really interesting things that you touched on is one, how podcast networks are sort of turning into MCNs, and there's good and bad things to that, right?
Yeah.
As you mentioned, like, hey, having a hands-off approach and trusting somebody else to do it, where we've seen that backfire. Podcast networks like Cast Media, that got exposed for stealing millions of dollars in creator funds from its creators like Theo Vaughn and others. But also like at the same time, just not being like as effective. I like because of just being like so nichely focused on being a podcast like network. Do you see that podcast networks will eventually meet the same kind of like demise that MCNs have met? And then on the second front, um, like where do you think like the sweet spot is for you guys?
Yeah. So the future of podcast networks, I think, is very unclear right now. It really depends on how podcasting continues to grow and evolve. One of the things that I think explains why we're where we're at is the fact that podcasts are still very much offline. A lot of the like reach and viewership metrics are completely hidden. If you have an audio only podcast, or if you're listening to this right now on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, you don't know how many people are listening. But
Yeah.
if you watch a TikTok or a YouTube video, you can see exactly how much views. And brands can also see that information.
Yeah.
And so podcasts are very opaque in how they report and how they present themselves. And so there's a huge benefit for a network that can collect all that data through the hosting platform and then present that directly to brands. That's going to make brands feel a lot more comfortable. So that's kind of why we're here. But I am a big proponent of video podcasts. And I know that YouTube is investing heavily into features,
Yeah,
but also bringing in podcasts to the platform. And I can tell you exactly why if we have time for it. But the short
absolutely.
is podcasts are long form, highly engaging. They're normally reoccurring. It's a very habitual experience for listeners. I listen to probably a dozen different podcasts every single week because I really enjoy them and they are very consistent. And so, if you're a platform like YouTube, you love that because you want to increase your retention to sell more advertising, to get more members. And so, I believe that if podcasts continue to expand into more video, and we get more public impressions to the viewership and the reach of those episodes, that will allow more and more talent managers and agencies to represent podcasts directly. So, if that happens, yes, I can definitely see, maybe as you framed it, the demise of the podcast network, or at least the decrease in their popularity. But there's a big if, a lot of people are hardcore about podcasts being an audio first platform. And if YouTube makes that difficult and doesn't really allow for audio only listening, it could be difficult. But I'm very hopeful and I'm betting big on YouTube. So hopefully things will work out for podcasters.
Yeah, I think YouTube, well, I think just Google and YouTube realizing, like, hey, why should we have like Google Podcasts when we can just roll that into like YouTube Music? I think it was, like, a tremendously smart thing. I can tell you that like the RSS capability for it, I think, is like tremendous. Because like it took no time at all to literally get like all my stuff like um connected from like Spotify to YouTube, and like that was like a blessing. Um, I've really always been like a proponent of like audio first. Like, when we had our conversations, like I, tried to figure like when I was doing the conception for Talk of the Town is like what makes sense to do. Is it like easier to do audio first and then move into video? You know, and like I think that's the sweet like spot that people have to find.
Yeah.
Now I'm like very fortunate where it's like I found that little like spot of like, okay, audio for like topic like podcasts where there's not a guest, video for when there is a guest.
Yeah.
Because I think it makes it more like personable and easier to manage. Um, you know, do you think that in sort of this like platform war that we're seeing right now with like YouTube and TikTok, who do you hypothetically see coming out on top? Because it seems like YouTube will do something, TikTok will do it, TikTok will do something, YouTube will do it. Like, who do you think is sort of having the better advantage for creators right now?
Yeah, well, maybe I've already played my hand on this question. I think at the beginning of the episode, I said I've been watching YouTube since I was a kid, so my whole life. And I said I'm a big fan of YouTube and betting on the future of it for podcasts. So I personally, as someone who doesn't use TikTok and am not very familiar, I probably have to bet on YouTube, but the future is unclear. I think at this point, YouTube is such an amazing platform, not only because you have short form, long form, live streams, podcasts, you have so many avenues, but then you also have the amazing Google ad platform behind it. So I think that YouTube's incredible as a user, but also as an advertiser. And when it comes to being a creator, is there any other platform that even compares to YouTube partner program or actually paying out creators? In my opinion, absolutely not. So I would say YouTube definitely is my bet for the future.
And then the last two questions I have for you before we wrap up, because I know you're way busier than I am, is one for creators who are either looking to start making content or in that small to medium audience, what is your advice? And then the second question is, what are you looking to achieve? Like what does the future for the next year and a half look like for you?
Yeah, good question. So, my advice to kind of up and coming creators is try your best to be consistent, put out the highest quality content you can, and be positive. I think this last one is something that I'm a really big fan of. I think that if your content makes people feel good and is actually positive, not only is it going to be better for you and your mental health, better for your longevity, but also your community will be more positive. I think whenever I see creators that maybe they want to make controversial or trending content, if it isn't positive in nature, especially in gaming, a lot of the times you see gaming creators say, "Oh, this Call of Duty's bad," or "I'm really upset with how Fortnite is going." If that's the type of content you're putting out there, your community is going to fall in line with that. And so, my experience as a small creator with the third party podcast was we were really positive. We loved Apex Legends. And so, we kept the content positive, and the result of that was an incredible community. Our Discord was unbelievably positive. We had an amazing support system. We had a Patreon membership that was really incredible. And so I think consistency, quality, positivity are some really good things to lean on as a up and coming creator.
Absolutely. Now, one final thing, because it just came up across my screen, and it has to do some part in relation to creators. It got announced yesterday that Skydance, the company behind Mission Impossible, Top Gun Maverick, and a few other projects, has now bought Paramount. Paramount owns VidCon, obviously.
Yeah.
What do you think that means for the future of creators with traditional entertainment?
Yeah, I don't know. It's kind of a loaded question. I think I didn't go to VidCon this year. I was there last year, and I feel like every year a lot of people in the community say, "Oh, VidCon's different now. It's not how it used to be." Um, I'm not super worried about that. I think that VidCon is allowed to evolve with the industry. I think that as more and more creators can build businesses around themselves and host their own in-person events without an external convention, that's a good thing for the industry. So I think that media companies buying other media companies, I don't think it's going to harm creators individually, but it just means that there's more options out there now, and hopefully competition will prevail and things will improve in the long run.
Absolutely. I feel you on VidCon. I've never been to VidCon. I've been to TwitchCon 2 years in a row. This year I have to take a pause on it because unfortunately my favorite band is going to be in a city about an hour away from me on one of the days of TwitchCon. And I already made that compromise the first time I went to TwitchCon of like, okay, I'm gonna miss out on you guys for the first time in years. I'm like, I'm not gonna miss out on you again. So
Fair
like,
enough. Fair enough. You got to
that,
support them.
then also I went to TwitchCon in San Diego, TwitchCon in Vegas. I've met all the people I'd want to at this point. What more is there to do?
Totally fair. Totally fair.
Well, Henry, I appreciate you, hopping on to the podcast. For those that want to, check you out, see what you're doing, feel free to plug, the social media or the places to be.
Yeah, I'm a bit embarrassed to say it, but my social media of choice, if you want to find me, is actually LinkedIn. So Henry Burreson, go check me out over there. I try to post content as frequently as I can about exactly what we talked about today. So if you want more, LinkedIn is where to find me.
Absolutely. Well, Henry, hopefully, the journey goes well with Soundwave and Creator Consult. I'm definitely gonna pick your mind on a few things that I've got going on in my personal content life, but we'll table that for another day. But for those listening to the podcast, watching the podcast, thank you so much for tuning in to a new episode. And with that being said, we'll see you all in the next one.